Agarwood shaving Second Incense P1. When Clementine told me this story excitedly, I was reading in the library the records of Sir Macedonian's mission to China to meet Qianlong. The long ebony platform, the shadowy bookshelf, the slightly cold scent of books, the memorials of the ministers, the ivory picks, the 5-color plates of Qing dynasty dress and the brocade sleeve, the gloomy and quiet air, and Kelly Menting, an Irish girl, is not very harmonious. Clementine has naughty straw yellow hair, which is not very well permed, and is piled on her shoulders like a load of firewood. Her face is covered with acne, and there is a small concave mouth under her long, sharp nose, but her small blue eyes are lively. Maybe she will look better in 2 years. She was wearing a sea green floral silk dress, with small starched white laces nailed to the edges of the sleeves. She flipped through the book, pretending not to mind, and said in a joking tone, "My sister gave me some sex education yesterday." I said, "Really?" Clementine said. "Yes," I said. "It's really impossible." Apart from looking at her and smiling, there seemed to be no second appropriate reaction. There are many modern girls who openly express interest in sex. But I am surprised that Clementine talked about this with me today, because she and I are still very distant friends. She followed up and said, "I'm really shocked. What do you think? After a person has this kind of knowledge, he can't fall in love at all. All beautiful illusions are ruined. The reality is so filthy." I acted indifferently. She looked like, "I'm surprised you found out so late." She was 19 years old. I added, "Most Chinese girls have known it for a long time, so there is no mystery. Our novels are more straightforward than yours, and we have more opportunities to read this kind of books than you." Speaking of obscene stories, Clementine seemed to have one she wanted to tell me, but I knew it would not turn out to be an obscene story, but a sad story. Life is often like this, incomplete. Clementine adopted a calm, purely objective, middle-aged attitude, but under the colorful acne, her face was also slightly red. She rested her arm on the story of Macedonian's envoy to China and said, "There is one thing that is very much talked about in Hong Kong social circles. I didn't quite understand it at first, but now I understand it. A dirty story, but people are always dirty. People are always dirty when they are attached to it." In a dim corner of this library, there are piles of books that are hundreds of years old. They are all human stories, but there is no human smell. The long years have given them the cold fragrance of books. This is the cold storage room of emotions. Listening to Clementine's story here, I had an inappropriate feeling, as if I was watching a fight in the clouds, which was a bit cruel. But no matter what, please light your incense and sprinkle on some agarwood chips, because the story of Clementine is relatively short. First, we see Roger and Biden driving a car. Maybe it was a sunny day, maybe it was cloudy. For Roger, it was a light-colored, high-pitched world, full of light and music. His huge joy, in his burning years, was like a cicada at noon in summer, shouting endlessly, "Squeak, squeak, squeak." A clear singing voice. Then, it's so thin that it's almost broken, but it's so shocking that it makes people deaf. Roger and Baden drove his car on a rampage, and his driving method was simply unbecoming of a 40-year-old university professor. But he was convinced that he would never cause trouble, and he had a sense of safety. Today, he is an important person, and everyone has to give him 3 points. Because at 2 o'clock this afternoon, he will marry the most beautiful woman in the world. His bride's hair is light golden, and when he puts his hand in her hair, it feels like the desert wind is blowing on the back of his hand. The wind contains fluffy golden sand, which is dry, gentle, and tickles the body. Land, there is always a gust of wind in the ripples of her hair, and at the same time, her honey-brown skin is so clear and as quiet as death. Her name is Suxi Mediocre. Roger chewed on his lower lip and smiled. He is a romantic fool. He has taught chemical physics at South China University for 15 years, and served as the director of science and dormitory for 4 years. But it has not affected him in the final analysis. He is still a romantic fool. Why not examine his marriage from a more realistic perspective? He earns 1,800 Hong Kong dollars a month, and his residence is provided by the school authority. It is a pretty good career, but not much of a future. Su Xiao is still very young. For her sake, she should choose a husband with a future. But her mother, Mrs. Mikir, had been widowed early in life and was unable to take her 3 daughters back to China. In this corner of Hong Kong, there are not many potential husbands. Roger, a quiet and ordinary bachelor, is not to be underestimated. So Mrs. Michelle allowed Roger to come to their home. Susie easily thought she was in love with him. Most of the people she played with were young officers. She looked down on them and felt that her own intellectual age was higher than theirs, and only Roger was different. Later she agreed to marry Roger. Roger didn't want to think so. This is his reasonable estimate of the situation. But this reasonable estimate only applies to ordinary people. Suxy is Suxy. Until she met Roger last year and fell in love with him, she had never thought about getting married. Mrs. Mikir's tutoring is so strict. Although Suxy is 21 years old, she is still a pure child, so innocent that people cannot believe it. Her sister Mi Lisheng got married in Tianjin, which was a huge blow to her, and she couldn't bear to leave her sister. Mi Lisheng's marriage was unfortunate. Legend has it that the man was an abnormal beast, and Mi Lisheng divorced quickly. Because she had too many sad memories of Tianjin, she was willing to leave Tianjin. So Mrs. Mikir took Mi Lisheng and her 2 daughters and moved to Hong Kong. Now Suxy is getting married again. Maybe she was too young. Due to her special environment, her psychological development was not mature, but her amazing beauty did not allow her to marry late. Roger pedaled the motor tightly, and the car shot rapidly toward the mountain. He is a fool to marry such a childish lady. Just be stupid. You only have one chance in life. He loves her. He loves her. I'm going to pay her a visit anyway before going this afternoon. Is she alive and well there? Will she show up at the chapel on time? Mrs. Mikir would not let him see the bride, because on the day of the wedding and before the wedding, the groom should not see the bride, as it would be unlucky to see her. Moreover, he had already called Mikira's family twice this morning. If he went there again, he would make them laugh. He had to make some excuses. It wasn't easy. Everything in the new house has been fully arranged. The best man and the best man were lively without any sign of illness. The wedding rings were not lost. After the wedding, they will entertain relatives and friends at the bride's house, so there is no need for champagne and refreshments. He has to worry about it. Oh, by the way, there is only one thing. The bride and bridesmaids' bouquets have been ordered, but he can buy half a dozen expensive tropical orchids for Mrs. Michelle and Mi Lisheng to wear. Logically, he should have called them to ask them what color clothes they were going to wear. But he felt that the white and crystal purple orchids were the easiest to match. So he took the liberty of buying them, which was definitely not a big mistake. So when his car passed the station of the Peak Tram, he stopped, went to the flower shop attached to the station to buy flowers, took the box in his arms, got on the car again, and drove towards the high street. This high street is named because the street is several feet higher than the houses along the street. This is also one of the special phenomena of Hong Kong's rugged terrain. Mrs. Mikir lives in an old small red brick house. The second-story windowsill faces the fluffy green grass along the street. A bamboo pole was picked out from the window and was placed on the cement road. On the bamboo pole were hung white mattress sheets, orange curtains, and the student uniform of the petite sister Kesseling, a sky blue skirt and suspenders hanging down. Kesseling was skating in the middle of the street, and she shouted from afar, "Roger! Roger!" Roger stopped the car, waved to her, and said with a smile, "Hello, Kesseling." Kesseling sneered. Lachila swayed and slid over here. She was going to be a little girl carrying a flower basket this afternoon. She had already dressed up, neatly wearing a pink and blue gauze ruffle dress with a bow on her head. Roger smiled and said, "Be careful if your clothes get dirty. They won't let you enter the chapel." Kathleen curled her lips and said, "They won't let me in. Without me, you can't get married." Roger laughed. He asked, "What are they doing?" "Are they very busy?" Kathleen whispered. "Don't go in." "They are crying?" Roger was surprised. "Are you crying?" Kathleen Ling said. Sexy also cried, and so did Mother. Shang also cried. Shang cried first, and then Sexy also cried, and Mother also made them cry. Only I didn't want to cry, so I stayed inside. I was a little embarrassed, so I came out. Roger was silent for a while. Kesseling bent down to adjust the laces of her skates and lifted her short skirt to the back of her neck, revealing a bare spine above her trousers, with white traces of talcum powder sparsely printed on the spine. Roger looked at the deserted street. On the other side of the street, an Indian woman, wearing a rose-purple cloak with lemon-yellow lotus-style trousers exposed underneath, walked into a gray shabby bungalow. Behind the house, there was no obstruction at all, just the pink sky and sea. The weather was hot and muggy, and I couldn't tell whether it would be sunny or overcast. Roger put his arms on the car door, held his head in his hands, crying. On the wedding day, of course, that's reasonable. A girl leaving home and her mother for the first time has a slightly sentimental atmosphere, which is appropriate and even necessary. But it seems a bit too much to express love and stop politeness. In any case, this is not a plundering marriage in primitive society, where the daughter is married off to another tribe, separated by life and death, and never have the chance to meet again. While he was thinking this, he felt deeply that he was selfish. Mrs. Mekier is a person who has nothing except these 3 daughters. The relationship between their mother and daughter is naturally extremely close. Now that he was taking Sexy away, would he be willing to give them these last few hours of farewell? But he was an Englishman, and he always felt that any display of emotion, unless absolutely necessary, was somewhat superfluous. He is afraid of the real life of blood and flesh. Unfortunately, people are alive, but the less we talk about it, the better. Unfortunately, he was petty, but he knew how silly that was. Only today can he indulge himself in being so stupid. Just like what he just told himself. Just be stupid. You only have one day in your life. The women in the room could cry, but he had to go and greet her. Even if he couldn't see her, he could still get some news about her. He jumped out of the car, brought flowers, walked down the slender stone steps, and went to press the bell on the door of Mikira's house, who opened the door for him in order to entertain guests. The dark and spacious living room was tidied up today. No dogs or children had been let in, so it seemed a bit empty. There were freesias and lilies in the bottles. In the dining room beyond the dome door, there were a full set of sparkling champagne glasses and stacks of colorful plates. The sandwich bread on the big plate was covered with an Irish linen cover. Be strict, Roger sat down in his usual green-painted wicker chair. As soon as I sat down, Mrs. Mekier came in. On a hot day, it is not suitable to be emotional at all. If a person is fatter, it will be even more difficult. Mrs. Mekier's forehead was covered with sweat, like a silver-white beard. Her eyes were still red. She held her hands together and placed them on her heart. She asked, "Roger, why are you here at this time? What happened?" Roger stood up and said with a smile, "No. What? I bought some flowers and sent them to you and me, Shang. I hope the colors don't conflict with each other. I wish I had thought about it earlier." He never paid much attention to the clothes women wore, but now he took a special look at Mrs. Mekier. She had already put on her clothes. It was maroon, but Mrs. Michelle was always used to wearing black. Her personality had absorbed a lot of the dark atmosphere of the usually strict widows. She could wear any color. Her clothes always seemed to be all in black. Although she was fat, she was still looking pitiful. She opened the flower box and exclaimed, "Look at you, wasteful child." After saying that, she came over and kissed him, making her eye circles even redder. Roger asked, "How do you feel about Sexy? Are you okay?" Mrs. Michelle smiled reluctantly and said, "She is fixing her hair. I see you. There is no need to sit here any longer. She is very confused right now. Where is she? Do I have time to entertain you?" "Even if I have time, it won't work. That's the rule. If you have already had lunch, you can go change clothes." Roger was reminded by her words, and he vaguely remembered that ordinary people seemed to have such a habit of eating between 12 and 1:30 at noon. He said, "I'm not hungry. I just had something to eat in the morning." Mrs. Michelle said, That's amazing. You don't even want to eat. That's not okay. Roger had to pick up his hat and said, I'll go to the restaurant right now, Mrs. Michelle said. I don't believe you will really go. My dear Roger, you are starving and nervous, and it will be inappropriate in the chapel. You should wait here for a while. I will go. Let me get you something cold to eat. Then he hurried out. After receiving her invitation, Roger suddenly felt that he really needed to relax his nerves. He leaned on the wicker chair, straightened his legs, and put his hands in his trouser pockets, whistling softly. Halfway through, I realized that he was playing a wedding march, so I stopped immediately. As soon as the door opened, Mi Lisheng walked in holding an electric fan. Mi Lisheng probably didn't know anyone was in the living room. Her face was wet with tears, and her auburn hair was disheveled on her cheeks. Wearing a half-worn snow-green crepe scoop neck blouse, an ivory-white chanting silk skirt. Perhaps in the eyes of some people, Mi Lisheng is as beautiful as Su Shi, but her face is too thin. She has thick double eyelids like Su Shi, but the corners of her eyes are slightly drooped, giving her a sad charm. Roger jumped up and said with a smile, Good morning. Radisson Blue. Mi Lisheng stopped and said, Ah, you're here. She put the electric fan on the ground and walked towards him quickly. When she came to him, she put a hand on her exposed throat and whispered, Called Roger. Roger felt very uneasy. He pushed the wicker chair behind him a little further, and then he stepped back and asked, Mi Lisheng, are you feeling a little uncomfortable? Mi Lisheng suddenly grabbed his shoulder, held his face with her other hand, and said in a sob, Roger, please be careful with your pet. Roger smiled and said, Don't worry, I love her, I won't be careful about her. As he said this, he gently removed the hand she had placed on his shoulder, and took a step back to the side of the wicker chair. Mi Lisheng put her hands on the back of the wicker chair dejectedly, and then she staggered and fell onto the wicker chair. Roger was anxious and asked repeatedly, What's wrong with you? What's wrong with you, Mi Lisheng? Mi Lisheng turned around, leaned on the back of the chair, and burst into tears. She cried on one side and spoke on the other. Roger couldn't hear clearly. She said something and had to bend down and say softly, I'm sorry, Mi Lisheng, please say it again. Mi Lisheng raised her head, opened a pair of empty blue-gray eyes, stared at the electric fan on the ground in fascination, and said intermittently, You love her. My husband also loves me, but he treats me. His attitude towards me is worse than an animal. He simply doesn't treat me as a human being, because, he said it's because he loves me. Roger stood up straight and turned his back. He turned around and said, Mi Lisheng, you shouldn't tell me these things. I'm not qualified to hear your family's secrets, Mi Lisheng said. Yes, I shouldn't tell you such shameful things and embarrass you. Why should you give me sympathy? Roger turned his back to her, frowned, and pinched his two fingers tightly. They fisted each other gently, and said in a solemn, slightly stiff voice, I fully sympathize with your misfortune. Mi Lisheng said in a trembling voice, Don't misunderstand me. I'm not telling you to ask for your sympathy. I'm afraid of my pet. Men are all the same. Roger was filled with heart. He laughed unhappily and interrupted her. You are wrong about this. There are very few people like your husband. Mi Lisheng put her pointed chin on the back of her hand, looked at him sadly, and said, How do you know you are not one of the few? My husband looks like a very normal person. Maybe you haven't noticed any difference between you and others. This is your first marriage. Roger suddenly lost control of himself. He turned around and shouted to Mi Lisheng. Yes, this is my first time to get married. Please remember, in 2 hours, I will get married. When are you not allowed to say these frustrating words to me today? Mi Lisheng cried, Please forgive me. I am doing this just for the sake of jealousy. Roger said, For the sake of jealousy. Even if I am the most normal person will drive you crazy. Are you planning this for Su Shi? Mi Lisheng sobbed and replied, I'm scared for Su Shi. Roger shook her shoulders vigorously. Shang asked, Does Suxi know the truth about your divorce? Mi Lisheng was shaken to tears by him and was speechless. Roger said, Say, have you told your sister these words? What a bad impression that should leave in Suxi's mind. How could he overcome the horror of being petty? Mi Lisheng shouted, "Roger, stop it. I can't bear it." Roger let go of her shoulders, threw her on the back of the chair with a bang, and said, "Tell me your matter. Your mother will do it naturally, you know very clearly. Where is your sister?" Mi Lisheng replied tiredly. "She doesn't know. Do you think my mother will allow her to know? Even the newspapers we read have to be checked by my mother before we can read them." Roger gradually regained his breath, and he also felt unusually tired. He grabbed his hat and wanted to go. While there was still time, he wanted to go back and drink 2 glasses of whiskey to refresh himself and then change into his formal clothes. He had long forgotten what he was waiting for here. At this moment, Mrs. Mikir came in tremblingly, wearing a peach blossom apron with a white background and red edges, carrying a food plate. When she saw Mi Lisheng, she was startled. Roger coughed dryly and explained. Mi Lisheng brought a fan down, and suddenly he fainted. Could it be that he had heat stroke? Mrs. Mikir sighed and said, "The busier you are, the more people feel cause trouble. Come up and lie down for a while." She helped Mi Lisheng up and carried her to the door. Mi Lisheng said, "Okay, I can walk by myself." Then he went upstairs timidly. Here Mrs. Michelle forced Roger to eat the cold beef liver and canned asparagus soup she had prepared for him. Roger ate without making a sound. Mrs. Michelle sat down aside and asked slowly, "What did Mi Lisheng say to you?" Roger picked up a napkin and wiped his mouth, and replied, "About her husband." As soon as these words were spoken, a cold wind seemed to blow through the room, and Mrs. Mikir remained silent for a long time. Roger balled up the napkin tightly and put it on the plate. Watching it gradually loosen up, he reached out to ball up the napkin again and squeezed it tightly. Mrs. Michelle gently she put her hand on the back of his hand and said in a low voice, "She shouldn't tell you this today alone. But I think you can understand that today, she feels particularly uncomfortable, sexy, and you are so happy. It's a bit exciting to watch. You know, she is a sad person." Roger picked up the napkin again, pulled off a corner, wiped his mouth, and smiled faintly. Of course, Mi Lisheng is pitiful. So is Mrs. Mikir. So she is also pitiful. With such an appearance and such an age, she has been buried in the stank, hot, foreign town all her life, marrying such a person like him. A mediocre person who has lived half his life without merit or deeds. He was pitiful himself. He loved her so much that when they were together, he was always afraid that he would do some un-English stupid thing. Maybe he would shed tears, kiss her hand, kiss her foot. No matter who you love, you should always be pitiful if you love to that extent. Who is not pitiable? There are not so many pitiable people. He should say a few words of sympathy and indignation to Mrs. Mikir. Mi Lisheng was his sister. His sister was bullied, so he had to express his sadness, but he couldn't. Today, he is a selfish man. He is the groom, the center of all people's attention. Everyone should understand him, comfort him, make fun of him, congratulate him, and mourn his lost freedom. Why did he meet so many selfish people today? Everyone surrounded by their own tragedy. Where? Mrs. Michelle cried again. And she said, "Why does my child have the same miserable life as me? Who would have thought? He just looks like me." Mr. Michelle died, leaving 3 children behind, and followed him. I live a life of great hardship, which is a common thing in the world. Nothing like this. A strange change of heart. It's hard to say it out loud. How will you behave after being called Mi Lisheng? She turned around to find the handkerchief. Roger, looking at her, her ribs were soaked with sweat. Her back was also sweaty, and her maroon clothes turned black. Tears and sweat, tears and sweat. A gloomy, hot day, a wedding day. He suddenly felt sick. Undoubtedly, both Mrs. Mikir and Mi Lisheng had every reason to be sad. Roger and Biden is one of the reasons. Because of him, Mrs. Mikir lost all her charm. In order for Sexy to marry him today, Mi Lisheng touched her heart. Roger should feel sorry and guilty, but he only had a strong dislike for them. Who doesn't hate people they treat wrong? Roger knew very well that at that moment he was a savage, unreasonable animal. He stood up, put on his hat and laughed. After leaving the door, I just remembered and poked my head in again and said, I think I should go. Mrs. Michelle's eyes were blinded by tears. She groped for her handkerchief like a blind person. She took a few breaths from her nose and said in a rustling voice, Go, my dear. I wish you happiness, Roger said. Thank you. He went outside and got into the car. There were some faint shadows of the sun on the street. Kesseling stood in front of a stall selling papaya, looking at it with her hands behind her back. When she saw him coming out, she called to him, Are you leaving, Roger? Roger didn't look at her, but waved his hand. Just drove the car away. More than an hour later, in the church, his mood became slightly calmer. The flames of rows of white candles danced in front of the gold-woven curtain. The music on the organ was like a strong wind, blowing the candlelight straight to one side. The long windows on both sides of the altar are made of purple glass. The bishop stood on it, with a pink scalp and short snow-white hair that looked like a bayberry dipped in sugar. The purple reflected in the window gave him a green lotus-colored overhead round light. Everything is joyful and rational. Roger wished his mother were here. She was too old, otherwise he might have brought her from England to attend the wedding. The tune of the music changed, and the excitement came. He turned slightly to one side so he could see her. No need to look at it. Every subtle carved line on her face and body was familiar to him. Familiar, at the same time. It was a little vague, as if she was a picture he drew in his previous life. No, he thought a picture drawn but not finished. Now, the dream he had in his previous life slowly came towards him, wrapped in silver-white gauze. It came towards him in the clouds and mist. Walking past the rose-colored window, she turned rose-colored. Walking past the blue window, she turned blue. Walking past the golden-yellow window, she and her hair burned. Then came the wedding dialogue, the bishop's sermon. The bride and groom and all the witnesses went to the small room inside to sign. And when they came out, the guests threw rice grains and red and green confetti at them. When he went to take pictures, he and Sexy were in a car alone. At this time, there was no church music or noisy people in his ears. Everything was quiet, and he felt uneasy again. Sexy smiled at him through the wedding veil, like a big expensive doll wrapped in cellophane, nestled in a pile of curled white papers. He asked, Are you tired? Sexy shook her head. He came closer and whispered, If you are not tired, I hope you will answer me. Sue smiled and said, Here we go again. How many times have you asked me? Roger said, Yes. This is the last time I ask you. It's too late now, but there's still time. Sexy held his face with both hands and said softly, You funny man, Roger said. Sexy, why do you like me? Sexy slowly wiped his eyebrows with her two thumbs. He went over and said, Because your eyebrows are like this. Then he slowly wiped it along his eyes and said, Because your eyes are like this. Roger took her hand and kissed it, then went to kiss her mouth. After a while, he asked again, Do you like me enough to marry me? I mean, do you really know that you like me to this extent? She repeated, Funny person. They kissed again. After a while, Sexy realized that Roger was still looking at her thoughtfully, so she smiled, pinched her sharp lips, and blew a breath into his eyes. Roger had to close his eyes. The two kissed again. They took photos, and then went to Michelle's house to entertain the guests. The commotion lasted until evening, and the crowd gradually dispersed. When they returned to Roger's apartment, it was almost midnight. Because Roger is the warden of the male dormitory of South China University, his residence is very close to the dormitory, making it easy to take care of everything. The back of the house is connected to the student tennis court, and the front door faces a sloping, narrow driveway. The cement road, with iron railings on both sides, winds down the mountain. At that time, it was late at night, and the moonlight illuminated the ground with a clear blue sky. Outside the iron railings, dark green hibiscus trees grew crowded together. The hot air from the ground condensed into huge crimson flowers. Hibiscus is a South Sea species, filled with memories of tropical forests, memories of black monsters with bright eyes, and the love of semi-civilized people. Under the hibiscus tree, in the few gaps between the branches and leaves, there are all kinds of grass and flowers. all of which are poisonous yellow, purple, and deep pink, the saliva of the volcano. There is also a side peduncle lotus that blooms back to back, white with tiger yellow markings on it. Among these flowers and trees, there are countless insects, crawling and chirping, plus small silvery four-legged snakes and squeaking frogs, creating a huge and incomplete scene of restlessness, silence. Suddenly, there was a sound of footsteps on the cement road. A person was running down the road in slippers, and another person was chasing after him, shouting, "Zixi, Zixi." The thin slippers went faster than the person. She slipped down a long way with one bare foot. At the turning point of the iron railing, someone caught up with her shoes and tripped her. She hurriedly hugged the railing, slumped down, and disappeared. Roger was stunned and stood still for a while before continuing to run. When he reached the turning point, he could not find her. All the way to the end of the road, there was not even a shadow of a person. He was sweating in waves and soaked his striped pajamas. He stood under a tree, next to a well, with water gurgling into the tunnel. He knew clearly that no one could drown in a well, but he couldn't help but bend down and look into the well. The moonlight made it bright inside, and it was clear that no one could be hidden. This must be a dream, a nightmare. He didn't know how long he stood there. He heard someone talking on the street, and walking up the hill. They were two Chinese students. They knew that the dormitory master had just gotten married today, and no one was there to control them. So they came back to the dormitory so late after having fun. Roger hurriedly stepped out of the shadows and let them pass. If he had let them see him, they would have been very surprised. And they would have made many speculations and spread the rumor. He has always been a man who cherishes his reputation carefully. They passed by, and he was afraid that there would be others who would come back later than them. So he quietly followed him up and returned to his own room. Not all students at South China University took advantage of the dormitory's break to go out and dance. There is a 6th-year medical student from India named Mohindra, who is working hard there to apologize. "You must help me." As he said that, he ran towards him. Mohindra was so panicked that he crawled and fell off the bed. There was a dome-shaped tall mosquito net hanging on his bed. Suxi grabbed the net and twisted it several times until it was as strong as a stone pillar. She hugged the pillar in a daze. After all, the tent was hanging in the air and she couldn't bear the weight of her whole body, so she swayed from side to side along with the tent. Mohindra looked at her with clasped hands. Although he did not attend the dormitory's wedding today, he still recognized Suxi. Her romance with their dormitory was a common conversation material among the students, and their engagement photos were also published in the South China Daily. Mohindra asked tremblingly, Are you Mrs. Amberton?" This sentence, Sue listened carefully, was extremely harsh. She couldn't help but think about it for a moment, and she was already crying. While crying, he kicked his feet with only a gold satin slipper on his feet. The bare foot was scratched in many places, covered in blood. Her commotion alerted the neighbors, and a large number of students put on their shoes and crowded sleepily to the door of Mohindra's room. As soon as I opened the door, I saw that the room was dark, with only the light of a flashlight under the desk shining horizontally, illuminating the two pink legs of a woman's gauze pajamas, beating like drums. 3 feet away from her stood Mohindra's two black legs, thin and long, in ginger leather slippers. The door became more and more noisy, and one person asked, "Mohindra, can we come in?" Mohindra became more and more anxious and speechless, unable to answer. One of the students stretched out his hand and turned on the light. Mohindra ran towards them as if he were seeing a relative and shouted, "Look! What is going on?" "Mrs. Amberton," someone laughed and said, "What's going on?" "We were about to ask you." Mohindra was so anxious that he wanted to use force and said, "Why are you asking me?" "You, don't be slanderous." A person next to him stopped him and said, "I didn't say anything to you." Mohindra put his hands in his hair and scratched for a while, and said bitterly, "This is not a joke. It doesn't matter if you don't speak properly. My diploma may be in trouble. I was in a trance when I was studying. Mrs. Amberton, you bumped in, and you cried when you came in." After hearing this, everyone looked at each other. One of them suggested, "I don't know where Mr. Amberton is." Let's go find him. After Sue listened carefully, his face turned green. He gritted his teeth, stamped his feet and said, "Who dares to go to him?" No one answered. She raised her voice and screamed, "Who dares to go find him?" Everyone was silent for a while, and one student said, "Mrs. Amberden, please forgive us for not knowing the details and what to do." Disposal. Suxy buried her face in the tent, sobbed and cried, "I beg you not to ask me. I beg you. But you have to promise me not to look for him. I don't want to see him. I can't stand it. He is a beast." Everyone was stunned and did not dare to say anything for a long time. They were all young people. Seeing such a beautiful and sad girl, they all felt sad. They didn't know what to do, so they had to bring a chair and persuaded, "Sit down and have a rest first." Suxy leaned over and sat down, with her upper body lying on Mohindra's tent, crying until the sky turned dark. Her waist softened and the chair became unsteady. She actually slipped to the ground and knelt on the ground. All the students discussed, "What time is it now? Anyway, it's almost dawn. We can go and invite the principal or the dean of academic affairs." Mohindra just wanted to shirk the blame and said hurriedly, "Let's go quickly. If we go late, they will be blamed." Suxy stretched out a withered hand and waved it to stop them. After a long time, she managed to say, "I want to go home." Mohindra asked, "You're home? What's the phone number? Do you want to call someone to pick it up?" Suxy shook her head and wiped her tears and said, "I was planning to go back just now. I was going to go down the mountain to make a call, or call a car, later. I thought, no, I can't. My mother has been tired for me these days. I'm so busy now. Why don't I let her rest for a night? My poor mother. What will I tell her? Where is she?" A student spoke quickly and asked next, "Mr. Anbadeng." "He," Su Shirui shouted. "Don't mention his name." A liberal arts student wearing tortoise-shell-rimmed glasses sighed coldly. He took a breath and said, "The more sanctimonious a person is, the more disorderly his private life is. I have long thought that Amberden is too well-behaved, and I am afraid that he will develop a perverted mentality." There were several younger boys who kept asking questions, but some of the older boys kicked him out, saying that they were not qualified to hear about such things. A football player put his hand on his hips and said with righteous indignation, "Mrs. Amberden, we will accompany you to see the principal to discipline him. Hong Kong cannot stand." Everyone exclaimed, "This kind of person is worthy of being our professor. He is also worthy of being our dormitory master." They all encouraged each other and immediately went to find the principal. The liberal arts student was still attentive and said, "I woke up the old man in the middle of the night. Even if he was embarrassed to lose his temper in front of the wife, he would never be so enthusiastic to help. I think it's better to stay for a few more hours, and Mrs. Biden can take a rest in this room, and Mohindra can sleep in my room." The athlete frowned and whispered to him, "It's not appropriate to leave her here alone. Seeing her like that is very irritating. We can't give her a chance to commit suicide." The liberal arts student then said to Sue in detail, "If you have no objection, we will leave 4 or 5 people in this room to take care of you and give you courage." Suxy whispered, "Thank you, please don't bother me." The students discussed for a while and placed Suxy on a rattan chair. They recommended for people, including Mohindra, who leaned on the bed and slept for a few hours. Suxy was sitting on a wicker chair, with a towel wrapped around her body. Only her pale face was exposed. She was motionless, but her eyes were always open quietly. Outside Mohindra's window, there is a dark shadow cutting diagonally across the foothills. The sky behind the mountains is the icy blue of a frozen lake. Most of the moon is irregularly round, like a silvery patch of ice. Water. Soon, the moon disappeared, and the whole sky was frozen. It was still light blue, but it was already morning. The temperature was very low in the summer morning. Mohindra borrowed a white coat for Suxy to wear over her pajamas. However, Suxy felt that it was too shameful to see the principal like this, and expressed her willingness to go back to Amberden's house to get it. Something to change into. Some people volunteered to go there to find out the news. He walked past Amberden's car room and saw the doors wide open and the car was gone. It was obvious that Amberden had left home. The student went around to the front door and rang the bell, saying that he had something urgent to do with Mr. Amberden. Pooh replied that the master had not gotten up yet, but the student persisted in saying that it was urgent. Pooh refused to disturb Mr. Amberden at first and asked for help. He was so boring that he had no choice but to go in. After a while, he came out with a face full of surprise and asked the student why he wanted to see Mr. Amberden. Seeing this situation, the student knew that Amberden was indeed not at home, so he lied casually, excused himself, and rushed back to the dormitory to report the news. All the students here escorted Sexy and walked toward Ansai in a mighty manner. Pooh was surprised when he saw Sexy, but he couldn't figure it out. Sexy ignored him and changed into a black gauze casual clothes, and tied up her yellow hair with a black tired silk mesh scarf. The students accompanied her to climb mountains and ridges and took a shortcut to the principal's house. Sexy turned around and made a gesture to them, as if preparing to ask them to wait outside and let her go in alone. The students were a little timid when they got there, but they sat down on the steps before she could speak. They waited for several hours. When Sexy came out again, the sun shone yellowly on the wisteria trellis in front of the door. There were many dark blue morning glories, including purple ones, climbing on the trellis. The students raised their heads and looked at her quietly, eager to hear her account of the principal's reaction. Suzixian opened her mouth slightly, slowly touched the corner of her mouth with a finger, and remained silent for a while. When she spoke, her voice was also very calm. She said, "Mr. Buck felt sorry for me and sympathized with me, but he advised me to go back to Roger's place." She picked a dark blue morning glory and blew into the center of the flower. She remembered how he had looked at her in the car yesterday, when they came out of church, and she had breathed into his eyes to make him close them. Roger Amberden's eyes are blue. Although few people have noticed this fact, they are not actually very blue. But every time they are emotional, they can often imagine that they are the color of this morning glory. She blew on the flower again, smiled, put it in her hands, clapped her hands together, and flattened the flower. One student coughed and said, "Amberden usually flatters Buck, and he obviously does it well." Another student said, "Buck is afraid that if he makes a fuss, it will bring bad reputation to the school." Sexy threw away the flat morning glory. "The reputation of the school, such a broken school. So what if you ruin it?" "Roger, he ruined all her ideals," she asked. "Is your academic director malicious?" The students replied, "Yes," Sushi said carefully. "I remember that he was a kind old man who loved telling jokes to girls. Come on, let's go see him," the students said. "It's not very early now. Malicious has probably gone to school. We can go directly to his office." This time, the students gathered outside the two semi-flexible shutter doors without any scruples, listening to their conversations, including the secretary of the Dean of Academic Affairs. After hearing about it, school janitors, gardeners, and office staff from the medical, engineering, and liberal arts departments all came to join in the fun. Sexy and Malicious both lowered their throats, so they could only hear Malicious's questions and Sexy's half sentences in reply. But the content of the answers could not be clearly understood. After asking, Sexy stopped answering and just choked with sobs. Malicious called Mrs. Mikir and asked her to pick up the details immediately. Not long after, Mrs. Mikir and Mi Lisheng arrived in a panic, disheveled, in a business car. Malicious put an arm around Sue's slender shoulders, sent her out carefully, and helped her into the car. When the students saw Malicious, they quickly dispersed. "Go talk about it yourself." The focus of their attention right now is Amberden's whereabouts. Some say he must be too shameless to see anyone and is hiding. Some say he went to Wanchai to find a woman who can satisfy him. Some say the neurosis hidden in the subconscious breaks out, because one of the early symptoms of neurotic patients is often nymphomania. Roger and Biden was in pain, but he never imagined that so many people cared about him. The first night, he quietly returned to his bedroom and sat on the bed looking at the sexy photos hanging on the wall. The photo is in the shadows and cannot be seen clearly. He reached out and pulled the old-style movable hanging lamp low, and aimed the light at the frame of the photo. The lamp was old, but the antique porcelain lampshade inlaid with white dark dragons was recently selected for him by Suxi. The strong light shines on the glass of the photo, and her slender face like a white lotus floating on the water. He suddenly found himself kneeling on the cupboard like a child, having no recollection of how he had climbed up. Holding the photo frame with both hands, she kissed her slender face. There was only cold glass between them. No, it wasn't the glass. It was his hot lips that separated them. Suxi and he were in love, but his excessive enthusiasm separated them? So, is it his fault? No. There is another layer. When he lay on the bed again, like thunder and lightning, he realized this. It turns out that Mi Lisheng's husband is a very ordinary person. An ordinary person just like him. He fell asleep on his back, putting his hands under his head and neck. The electric lamp was less than a foot away from him, and the 75 lights were shining on his face, but he didn't feel it.
Alright, this part of the story ends here.
Want to know what happened next? Let's listen to the breakdown next time.